Chapter 41. Cale rubbed his face. He tried to read the clay tablets in front of him, but his mind wouldn't cooperate. Dwarven chicken scratch couldn't compete with the lovely Ayianna. Oh, how she plagued his mind. You should go to bed. Eluith fluttered down from the tall bookshelves lining the library and settled on the table next to him. Cale shook his head. He pushed the tablets aside and leaned back in his chair. I have to solve these riddles. A tired mind, and a distracted one at that, will not accomplish much. Cale glanced up at the arched ceiling and the pattern of colours swirling into each other. The design was chaotic, too much like his life to be enjoyable, but the bright colours weren't right. He wanted to get lost in a dull brown. He returned his gaze to Eloith. Tired or not, an accomplishment is still an accomplishment, no matter how small it is. The ferry captain grinned. What? You sound like Saeed. Cale sighed and sat up. I hope he's having better luck than we are. I still have to finish his letter. Am I to deliver it? No, I'll send it with King Renakwa's response. Cale ran his finger over the tablet's carved runes. Do you think Bonzapur will join the alliance? Yes. At least Saeed will have some good news then. Cale picked up a parchment and angled it in the light of the lamp. Eloith's distinct scrawling words translated the tonic's recipe and directions. She is a good woman. Who is? The young lady who is seeping into your thickly calloused heart. Cale glared at him. Isn't there a law against mind-breaching? No, Eloith grinned and crossed his arms. The Nagisu were thought to be destroyed. Why clutter the kingdoms with unnecessary rules? Still, I did not breach your mind. It is written all over your face and in your eyes. I don't suppose I could lie to a Nagisu. Some have tried, but why fear the truth? You don't understand. I can't. Cale clenched his jaw. My concern for her is nothing but a vow to her brother. Is it? And she is betrothed. Eloith rested his hand on his sword belt and studied him. Finally, he said, I do not like him. He should not be allowed to continue on this quest, in my opinion. Having a little clash of differences, are we? His essence reeks. All right, so maybe it's a little more than that. But Saeed didn't think he was the enemy. Cale shook his head. Don't misunderstand me. I would love to leave him behind. But where he goes, she goes. Cale clenched his teeth. He shouldn't care. He didn't want to care, but he did, and that complicated things. Concern flashed in the fairy's eyes. Her essence dims. If you do not do something, I am afraid. Hey, how's it going? Veen stood outside the doorway. Cale straightened. What are you doing up? I couldn't sleep. He slumped in the chair next to Cale. Besides, we have a tonic to find. Eloith has already found the recipe. We just need to figure out what it means. Oh, guardians and their riddles! Veen slapped his head. So what does it say? Cale smiled. Well, the tonic consists of 3 ingredients. A silver pinecone from the belly of the earth, healing waters from an underwater garden, and roots from the famor tree where giants roam. Oh, that's easy, Veen shrugged. We just sail to Maruya Island and chop off some roots, and anything to do with underwater would be the kingdom of the Kaleki. Cale frowned. We've figured that much, but what of the silver pinecone? Well, that's a good one, isn't it? Leon leaned forward and propped his elbows on the table. What does the riddle say? Silver pure, mind secure. Into the belly of the earth grows a tree of hailed worth. Through a maze of darkened stone hangs the silver pinecone. Oh, Vian glanced around the room. Any leads on that one? Eloith stepped over to the parchment, which is big as he was. From what we can gather, it's hidden away, buried deep in the ground. In order to find it, one must climb the highest to reach the lowest. From within, become the lowest to enter the highest to reach the lowest. Vian groaned. Must it be riddles? There you are, Vian! Desmond's voice boomed through the library. His face glowed as he strutted into the library like a rooster. I've been looking all over for you. "Where have you been?" Vian asked. Desmond's step faltered. "I've had few things to take care of. You three aren't working on that tonic thing already, are you? We just endured the desert and escaped from some blood-sucking creatures. We should take a break, enjoy the sights a bit." He stopped and shrugged. "Or not." "What do you want?" Cale asked. "Nothing to do with you, that's for sure." Desmond turned his attention to Vian. "Let's go down to the kitchen to see if they have any food left." "I'm not hungry." Vian fingered Eloith's parchment. "Besides, I'm working on a riddle." "Oh?" A frown marred Desmond's perfect features. Cale would have liked to permanently mar the man's face. Instead, he picked up the clay tablets and focused on translating the cramped runes of Tarok. "Well then," Desmond worked his jaw. "Have a pleasant night, Prince. And you as well." Footsteps disappeared from the library. Cale ground his teeth and shifted the clay tablets to the table. Where had that man been all day? If only he could think of a way to detain him without leaving Ayianna behind. Not that she needed to be hiking through dangerous mountains and jungles. A quest was no place for a young woman, even if she had held up better than many of the men he knew. His chest constricted. He couldn't leave her behind. Cale turned to the map. Since the Kavaro mountain range is considered the highest point in Nalu, perhaps our pine cone is hidden somewhere within. Eloith and Vian nodded. "Have you met Tarek yet?" Eloith asked. "Briefly, at breakfast. Why?" "He has expressed interest in joining our expedition. He says he can serve as our guide and translator. He is fluent in Tarok, Nihi, and Payamor. He mentioned a fourth, but I cannot remember it." "The king's nephew?" Vian raised his head. "We're practically the same age. Shouldn't a guide be a little older, more experienced?" Cale shrugged. "If he knows what he says he does, he could prove to be invaluable to our cause. But don't you think we have too many people already?" Vian glanced between Eloith and Cale and raised his hands. "Hey, I've got a special interest in this tonic. I won't stand aside and do nothing. My kingdom needs her prince to do something." "Of course, Vian." Eloith clasped his hands together and paced around the table. "We weren't suggesting we'd leave you behind." "We can figure it out later." Cale stood and stretched. "If Tarek is fluent in Tarok, then I'm going to bed. He can tell us what these clay tablets mean tomorrow." Back in his room, Cale stared out the window at the starlit sky. Ayianna's warm smile lingered in his mind's eye, no matter how hard he tried to shove it aside. Her essence dims. What did Eloith mean? If only Vian hadn't showed up. Still, he shouldn't take his frustration out on the prince. He had proven himself a better man than Cale had figured him for. He had potential. There might be some hope yet for Badera. Cale leaned against the stone windowsill. Celebratory lamps twinkled throughout the foreign city. The Haruzu would celebrate the king's union until morning. A sickening knot twisted in his stomach. That chapter in his life was closed. He pulled away from the window and turned his thoughts to the coming quest. The knot in his stomach sank. Their journey would cross mountains, jungles, and plunge to the depths of the sea. They'd face dangers, harsh weather, and who knew what else. It wasn't a risk he wanted to take with a young woman and her demented betrothed. Perhaps he could convince Desmond to stay behind, but as Eloith pointed out, where he went, Ayianna went. Yet, Cale couldn't see himself saying goodbye to her, at least not if that meant she'd be staying behind with Desmond. Why hadn't Taryn mentioned the betrothal? Of all the times her brother had tried to convince Cale of a double wedding, he had never once mentioned Desmond. So what did he feel for her? Was it only a promise to Taran, a transfer of friendship, or was there something deeper? Cale clenched his jaw. No, he'd chosen to join the Guardians. She was betrothed to a jerk. Their paths were already sealed. What could he do about it? Cale sighed. If he couldn't sleep, he could at least finish Saeed's letter. He returned to the small desk, pulled out the parchment and ink jar, and settled into the chair. He fingered the quill. Should he share Eloith's concerns? It seemed trivial compared to the events at Zajur and the upcoming quest. How would he tell Saeed about Ibrim? Maybe a second letter addressed to Adarin or Ibrim's family. He dipped the quill in ink, but the words wouldn't come. He shoved the parchments aside. What was his problem? He stood and stretched. He needed some fresh air. Maybe Osaran would break his silence.